Fukuzawa and Maruyama, How to Understand Japan. If the ideas sketched out in yesterday's lecture, the first lecture of this series, are roughly right, they have considerable implications for the way in which we should try to understand Japan. As I set out for Japan in June 1990, I did not consider myself an ethnocentric Westerner. The increasing sense of shock, which I will describe in my encounter with Japan, was not caused by moving out of the only culture I'd known into something else. It's true that I had worked a lot on European and British history and culture, and I had lived in England for over 40 years. Yet I had also spent over 18 months in Nepal and visited my anthropological fieldwork area there some 5 times, travelling through India on the way. I had been teaching anthropology at the University of Cambridge for 16 years, and I had read about, taught and supervised many students working on tribal, peasant and other cultures around the world. I had absorbed many of the relativistic assumptions of anthropology and the general sociological framework developed by the great thinkers from Montesquieu to Max Weber. Yet it is now clear to me that I did have a number of largely unexamined assumptions which caused difficulties in understanding what I was about to encounter in Japan. When I went to Japan, putting it rather oversimply, I thought there were only 2 major forms of society. There were integrated, largely oral, tribal worlds, such as the ones I had read about in Africa, South America and the Pacific, and visited in Nepal. These societies were still enchanted because they did not divide off the supernatural and natural worlds. Embedded because their economy and society were not separated. Without institutional divisions of the kind I accepted in my Western experience. These places were the core of what anthropologists had tried to understand. They were small, often peripheral, worlds struggling to retain their unseparated otherness on the fringes of larger civilizations. After the rise of societies with writing, cities, settled agriculture, craft, states, formal religions, the world had changed. Although the disassociations and separations were not completed until perhaps the 17th to 19th centuries, the great world civilizations were at least partially disenchanted, defamiliazed, disembedded. This transition was the great divide in my mind. I thought not so much in terms of pre- and post-industrial as tribal and civilizational. This scheme lay untested and unexamined in my mind. So what I expected to find in Japan was a civilization which was, in essence, totally removed from the tribal type. Whatever its form, it would be a variant on the great civilizational systems around the world. Thus, while France, England, America, India, or China were all very different, they were clearly within a similar order of world history. That is to say, there had been a great deal of institutional separation. Even if they were not entirely modern, they had elements of modernity in their makeup. They had, in Durkheim's typology, moved a long way down the continuum from mechanical to organic solidarity. I was full of certainty, confidence, and unexamined assumptions about my categories. These ideas seemed to fit all of the other worlds I had encountered in more than 20 years, attending seminars, teaching and writing on anthropology. I doubted whether Japan would challenge them. It was just a matter of seeing where it fitted in. Yet, as I wrestled to understand Japan through the 1990s, I found it became more and more confusing. I felt in the position that David Hume described. Let an object be presented to a man of never so strong natural reason and abilities. If that object be entirely new to him, he will not be able, by the most accurate examination of its sensible qualities, to discover any of its causes or effects. End of quote. This was a rather negative reaction, bewilderment. I had come across a new species that could not be classified or appropriated using the familiar sociological tools which I had up till then believed would be appropriate. Then, as I learnt to see Japan through the guidance of my friends, Professors Toshiko and Kenichi Nakamura, and through the eyes of Fukuzawa and Maruyama, I began to see a shape dimly emerging. It was of a totally different kind to that which I had expected, yet not entirely beyond comprehension. Slowly I began to realize the deep wisdom of Kurt Singer's observation that, quote, the Japanese are difficult to understand, not because they are complicated or strange, but because they are so simple. For a long time I found it impossible to see the world within the Japanese mirror, or to understand it when I did get glimpses of it, because it is not just trivially different from the West and other civilizations, but different at such a deep level that the very tools of understanding we normally use fail us. I believe that it is not possible to understand Japan if we use the conventional sociological and philosophical models of the West. These meta-models, or meta-tools, which sociology developed in the 19th century, the famous oppositions between community and association with capital letters, status and contract, feudalism and capitalism, do not help us to understand Japan. Japan does not fit within that framework. When anthropologists went to South America, Africa, New Guinea, Southeast Asia, they encountered tribal societies which did not fit within the grid of Western categories. It would have been fruitless to ask if they were based on status or contract, individualism or holism, or any of the other Western-derived oppositions. Instead, the anthropologists tried to form a notion of the interconnections, the relations between parts of a culture. They came up with a basically holistic methodology, They stress the functional interdependence of the parts and the impossibility of understanding any part except in relation to others, what was called structural functionalism. And they looked at the structural homologies between different realms, what was called structuralism. Their final description was placed within a comparative endeavour which, rather than merely classifying societies, saw each as a variant, different, yet in some ways a comparable entity. The outcome of accepting Fukuzawa and Maruyama's characterization of Japan as a deeply non-modern civilization is to lead us to wonder how an anthropologist would describe it. He or she would do so on the basis of two premises. The first is holistically, that the parts are not separated, so that in order to understand any part we have to understand the whole, as opposed to the methodological individualism which helps us to understand Western divided societies. The second premise is relationality or structuralism. That is to say that the meaning of things does not lie in the individual parts, but in the relations and in the relations of relations. Much of the work on Japan by outside scholars has been based on the assumption that we are dealing with a modern and hence separated and individualistic society. Hence, analysts look at bits of Japan, parts of the system. On the whole, such work is unsatisfying. It comes away empty-handed because the net is wrongly constructed and catches little. On the other hand, the work of some anthropologists has given rich insights into particular aspects of Japan, because they do have a more comparative and holistic a methodology. They have touched parts of the strangeness. However, what no analyst has really done as yet, it seems to me, is to link their cross-sectional portraits of the anthropological kind to the historical explanations of what they have found. Furthermore, most anthropological accounts tend to concentrate on the social and cultural side of life and pay less attention to the political economy of Japan. Furthermore, with the exception of one or two authors, they have not often seen that French structuralist anthropology, of the kind most famously practiced by Lévi-Strauss, to a certain extent by Bourdieu, with its emphasis on relations, is better fitted to understand Japan than the rather more individualistic Anglo-American structural functionalism. Increasingly over the years, I have felt that the difficulty of understanding Japan is because the methodological, individualistic, functional approach of much anthropology and sociology is not suitable. If we try to grasp Japan as a modern civilization where there are things, individuals, or discrete institutional forms, economy, religion, politics, society, we remain baffled. So it is necessary to realize that in studying Japan, the lowest entity is not a thing or an institutional sphere, a molecule or an individual, which is assumed in much of Western thought, including Durkheimian or post-Cartesian atomism. Rather, it is a relation. Everything is situational, relational, symbolically linked to something else. Barth's Empire of Signs, that's the name of his book, recognized this well enough. The sign stands between the signified and the signifier in Saussurean structuralism. This is how Japan works. In Japan, gardens, ceremonies, people, none can be understood in themselves, but always in relation to something else. It is a hall of mirrors, all reflecting each other, all empty in themselves. So to understand Japanese civilization, we have to apply an approach which, to a certain extent, Granet applied in his wonderful book on Chinese civilization, being a French structuralist in the Maussian school, but more obviously Lévi-Strauss in his work on Amazonia. In an odd way, we have to approach Japan as if it is the Bororo or some tribal structural civilization, yet with over 100 million people rather than a few thousand. If we do this, many of the both and contradictions which first puzzle us begin to make sense. Frequently, like many others, I have been struck by the hybridity of Japan, the way in which it seems to combine opposite things, violence and peace, innocence and pornography, and many others. This makes sense when we realize that the Japanese relations cut across or bridge things which we held apart in Western thought: natural and supernatural, individual and group, mind and matter. All the dichotomies stemming from Greek thought and later, indeed of all monotheistic and even to a considerable extent Hindu and Chinese societies, vanish away. We have relations between areas with which we are totally unfamiliar. The bundle of associations and meanings in each part of Japanese life is different. Anthropologists have long been aware of this in the tribal societies they have studied, where marriage, gifts, spirit, law cannot be translated into Western languages without either great explanations or distortions. Yet it has seldom been recognized that this problem also applies to one world civilization. Of course, each nation and civilization is unique. For Dumont to explain how Indian hierarchy and caste works, or Geertz to analyze Balinese concepts of a person, has required a similar effort. Even to translate Italian or French culture into English is difficult enough. Yet in each of these cases, the grid of the models we apply fits a good deal in, and then we have to explain what does not fit. What is odd about Japan is that hardly anything fits. There is hardly any congruence. From the very beginning, we are in an unfamiliar landscape, another planet, as many have put it, where the laws of gravity, time, motion, as we are familiar with them, do not work. We are in an Einsteinian or Isha-like world, as bizarre to us Westerners as the most bizarre of anthropological tribes. Yet, on the surface, Japan is sitting there with its 100+ million inhabitants, looking innocently as Western and modern as anywhere, if not more so. It is this looking-glass world into which we fall that when we go to Japan, as Alice fell down the rabbit hole, with a strange feeling of turning head over heels into a world with a different logic to it. If we look at Japan as a holistic, relational civilization, a great deal of the dichotomies, contradictions, and confusions fade away. We can begin to understand it and enjoy it as the last great working alternative to the capitalist, individualistic world of the West. It is a methodology which allows us to see Japan as it is, not through a Western grid. For the epistemological framework of modern anthropology was designed specifically for situations where observers had to enter into other cultures which they could not initially understand and which clearly did not fit into their categories. They needed a fairly value-free and non-ethnocentric methodology in order to get inside other cultural logics. If we consider Japan as basically of the tribal, that is, holistic and relational kind, it does not make them identical to the Nuer, Bororo, Haganers, or the Gurungs, whom I study. After all, they have, that is, the Japanese have writing, cities, higher crafts and money. The Nuer do not yet have the Shinkansen or Pachinko, as far as I am aware. Yet it places Japan in a class of object which is well approached through the holistic and structural anthropological approach. Of course, there is a danger that the method will construct the object, but abandoning the methodological individualism, which normally creates individualists, we will create structural persons, individuals, as Marilyn Strathern calls them. We may make a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a danger, but I believe that the test is as to whether it is worth pursuing this approach is the degree to which it really helps us to understand the complexity of Japan. Certainly, I found that the classical sociological framework just creates, as Bruno Latour might have predicted, hybrids. Japan as neither this nor that, without offering much beyond this negative understanding. The holistic method fits over the Japanese mixings so that they make some sense and can be translated, as the Nuer, Zandi, or Bororo worlds have been translated. This approach also shows how we can allow Japan to be different, not to absorb it mechanically into our world. It can be allowed to contribute some variation into our oversaturated and increasingly one-dimensional imaginations. As Maruyama correctly observed, the function of intelligence consists in any age in understanding others, to use Hegel's terminology, as others, in Irem and Erschein. The fact that Japan is the one great world civilization which cannot be divided into segments like an orange has an effect on how we come to understand it. Like a photo or painting, Japan is a gestalt. It is something we have to take in with one glance, or not at all. In this sense, it is like the standard tribal society studied by anthropologists. We cannot understand the tribal societies by looking at bits. The pieces of the jigsaw mean nothing away from the whole. Everything only has meaning when fitted with the other parts. This is one reason why I am trying to create a simple but total portrait. While necessarily superficial in relation to any one part, it tries to look at the whole, in the hope that the sum of the parts will give a truer sense than if one lingered longer on any one area at the expense of others. While it makes sense to approach somewhere like America or France by studying it bit by bit, Japan eludes us if we do so. The idea of taking a total picture of a total civilization, something similar to Tocqueville on America or Dumont on India, is important. By focusing on part of Japan, as even Ruth Benedict did by analysing only parts of the present and omitting much of the ecology, technology, economics and politics, means that the essence is lost. The meaning is not contained in a series of parts, but rather in the relationships between the parts. For example, kinship only has meaning when examined in relation to ritual, power and production. To dissect is to lose this meaning. This makes it difficult to study and write about Japan. It may partly explain why I've had to wait for some 15 years before I felt I might have a chance to capture an understanding of Japan as in a photograph. As we work day by day, it is only possible to approach an understanding bit by bit, using the usual Cartesian method of breaking complex problems into solvable smaller parts. Then, and only then, when all the bits are roughly mastered, have I found it possible to put it all together again. The lapse of time is needed in order for all the bits to fit together in the mind. So it has taken 5 visits, slow sedimentation, many conversations, a great deal of thought, comparison with macro-social theories, experience of Nepal and China, to make it possible to get Japan into focus. This also affects the writing strategy. I have had to break Japan artificially into parts: ecology, bonds, arts, and so on. Yet in each part, and then in each chapter, it was clear that the bits were struggling to link to other parts of the book. The seamless robe was being artificially torn apart. This has always been a central problem in anthropology, where an investigator lives in a small village and knows that everything they see or hear is possibly relevant to understanding, and that any separation of the parts will end in artificial distortion. Yet, while holding all this together and studying all aspects of a society is a large enough problem when working on and then writing a book about 2,000 people studied over a period or so, of a year or so, it is compounded greatly when dealing with millions of people over 2,000 years. You might say that I am just reiterating the approach pioneered many years ago by Ruth Benedict, and to a certain extent this is true. But I think that the difference is that we need not just anthropology, but history as well. If we stick with the present, we end up with what is basically a psychological interpretation. The Japanese are different because of some inner essence. It tends towards Nihon Jinron, the idea that Japan is unique and inexplicable and perhaps superior. We are liberated from this temptation and led into greater understanding if we ask ourselves not only what has happened, but how, historically, it has happened. And here I return to the insights of both Fukuzawa and particularly Maruyama in his basso ostinato theory, that we need to understand the deep history of Japan, of how Japan has evolved. Here is a lightning sketch of what I guess has caused the extraordinary situation in Japan. My dear friend, late friend Jerry Martin, coined the phrase bounded but leaky to explain how innovations happen in situations where there are sufficiently strong boundaries for strong developments to occur, yet the boundaries are sufficiently porous to allow in new ideas as they are needed. A metaphor would be a rock pool, developing its own rich life, but needing the periodic deposit of outside nutrients as the tide periodically sweeps over it. In our discussions on what might have happened in Japan, we, that is myself and those I was talking to, often thought of this metaphor. After Jerry's death, as I come to think about how Japan has preserved within its rocky pool a world inhabited by wondrous creatures, behaving in ways long lost to other world civilizations, I return to his idea. The first great Western historian of Japan, Engelbert Kampfer, described the fabled island of Japan. I quote, Indeed it seems nature purposely designed these islands to be a sort of a little world, separate and independent of the rest, by making them of so difficult an access, and by endowing them plentifully with whatever is requisite to make the lives of their inhabitants both delightful and pleasant, and to enable them to subsist without a commerce with foreign nations." End of quote. Throughout Japanese history, there has been a curious tension between closeness and distance from its Asian neighbours. It is this middling position which explains a great deal about the odd features which it has developed. In terms of closeness, the fact that Japan is only a few hundred miles away from the greatest, most ancient, and most creative of all civilizations, China, has overshadowed its whole history. The flow of high culture, both from China and also very considerably from Korea, has put Japan in a very fortunate position. Imagine if Japan had been where other great islands in the Pacific are mainly located, in the Indonesian archipelago. Placed thousands of miles away, it would not have become a rich mirror of all those very early and hugely impressive technologies and cultural artifacts which we associate with China. Much of its history has been one of living in the shadow of a mighty tree, which constantly shed new and exciting fruit and seeds upon it. Pottery and porcelain, silk, tea, weapons, writing systems, governmental systems, religions, and philosophies. What was it to do with this rich downpouring? What it learnt to do was to take the Chinese inventions and to readapt them, often turning them over and improving them even further. Thus, it improved or elaborated the pottery, the tea ceremony, the armour and the swords, the gardens, the Buddhism, the writing system. It maintained its bass note, Maruyama's basso ostinato, but imported treble notes. It changed, yet retained its essential essence and otherness. China itself had been in many ways a bounded but leaking civilization. It had developed perhaps the greatest, most coherent, and most powerful civilization in history by the time it came to deeply influence Japan. It was itself, in many ways, far from the type of civilization which was to develop at the western end of Eurasia. The art of screening, importing what was useful and then improving on it, learnt over 2,000 years, stood Japan in good stead when it had to do the same thing twice again in its recent history. At the time of the Meiji Restoration and early industrialization, a flood of Western things came in. Then again, after the Second World War and during the economic miracle, American things flooded in. The Japanese are historically the greatest imitator improvers in history. The large, some 20 million people by 1720, energetic, literate, and urbanized population was a perfect hothouse within its bounded island. It took seeds from elsewhere and made them grow into something exotic, both the same as their parent plants, but tending into new and more impressive shapes, like the miniature train trees or bonsai which decorate Japanese gardens. The novelty of the developments was made possible by the distance of Japan from China and elsewhere. If Japan had been like Korea, linked by land to China, it would have been overrun by its dominant neighbour, as Sinicized as Korea became. Even a small gap of relatively peaceful ocean, like the 20-mile English Channel, would not have protected it against such a mighty influence. The English were able to develop their relative autonomy and peculiar variations because they were normally faced by a divided set of relatively small nations. Seldom were they faced by a united great empire. When they were, in the case of Rome, they were overrun and Romanized. Closer to China, Japan would not have struck off in a singular way. The 100 miles of dangerous sea, combined with the inward turn in Chinese culture after it gave up its great maritime adventures in the early 15th century, protected Japan from invasions. In particular, along with Western Europe, it was the only part of the Eurasian continent not conquered by the Mongols. Japan became a sort of human Galapagos Islands. Ideas and institutions which had originally migrated in from many different sources mixed and formed a new mixture which, according to Japanese myth, set into a unified and largely uniform Japaneseness from north to south and east to west. We know that, in fact, even until the end of the 19th century, the social structure, marriage systems, and folklore of parts of Japan show that there were three great waves of in-migration. Strong traditions and peoples came in from the shamanic north through Sakhalin to the center through Korea. Much of Japanese culture and some Japanese clearly migrated in from China, and from Malaya, Polynesia, and other parts of the Pacific. People island hopped along the Ryukyu Islands to inhabit southern Japan. All this coalesced into a unique mixture which, as anyone can see from a short scrutiny of the vast variation of Mongolian faces on a Japanese street or underground, came from very different places. Yet, as in England with its mongrel population, the islandhood gave it very early a sense of national identity and of difference. It contained many civilizations, but mirrored none of them. There were strong dialect and cultural differences between different parts of Japan, yet there was a unified national language of literature, religion, and administration for more than 1,000 years. It had the size and diversity then to develop and experiment with what worked best within the particular ecology and geography of this long, rocky island. Over a period of over 1,000 years, it constantly tried out new schemes. In terms of politics and law, Chinese, feudal, quasi-Chinese, Germano-French, American layers of civilization were built on top of an original civilization which had already reached a very considerable sophistication and maturity by the 7th century. In the realm of religion and philosophy, a Shinto, Confucian, Buddhist, Neo-Confucian, Shinto-Western Neo-Confucian mix, followed by the modern American phase, were all archaeological layers. Each set of new clothes was reshaped to fit over the older clothes on the same growing body. There was great continuity, but also constant, often almost revolutionary change. There was a very careful filtering and selection of what came in from outside, which still prevails in Japan and was seen at its most explicit when the Dutch were limited to living and trading on a tiny island in Nagasaki Bay for several centuries, so that their influence could be monitored carefully. Dutch goods and some knowledge were fine. Western religion and diseases were less welcome. So what was thought useful was imported, adapted and spread, and the rest was excluded. The Japanese have devoted huge energy to quarantining themselves. They want to be seriously bounded, but allow in a certain amount, having discovered that this is the most satisfactory way to live. Controlled immigration, not so much of people, but of ideas and technologies and influences, has been at the heart of Japanese history. In the light of this separation, the odd shapes which I have encountered in many aspects of Japanese culture and society begin to become comprehensible. The refusal to fit into the categories of thought and action which were developed in either the West, for instance in the categories of thought in which I was trained, or the East, especially in China and also India, become comprehensible. As with Britain, almost all the elements in Japanese civilization were imported from abroad. There are very few macro inventions which we associate with Japan, of the order of gunpowder, compasses, printing, silk, tea, or the other great inventions of China. The Japanese cannot compare to the first great set of Chinese and Islamic inventions and ideas, or the later philosophical and technological macro inventions from the 17th century in the West. Yet they took each of these macro inventions and added value. So their pottery, gardens, swords, tea ceremony, etiquette, temples, lacquer work, netsuke, became exquisite and different. Just walk a few paces from the Chinese gallery in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London into the adjacent Japanese rooms. You will immediately feel that you are in a vaguely familiar yet entirely different civilization. In many ways, it is a more delicate, sensitive, and playful world. It has the quirky, irregular feeling of real creativity, all the more surprising since most of it originated from the hall next door. Those who live in the largish island of Britain have some idea of what has happened, because the British too were great borrowers, but then refined what they took. They borrowed their religion, law, language, social system, and technologies from the rich heritage of continental Europe, which in turn had borrowed much of it from Islam and ultimately from China. Yet over time the British, and particularly the English branch, also developed into a minor Galapagos Island, separating it off in its peculiarities from the mainland. So by the early 18th century, astonished foreign visitors to England marvelled at how they seemed to be in a different world to their homelands. If this could happen when an island was only 20 miles from France, and when the histories of England and the continent had long been intertwined by trade, travel and war, how much greater was the potential for a unique and separate existence as in Japan. The total population of Japan in 1700 was roughly 5 times that of Britain at that time. It had far greater cities, a far longer history of high culture, and ancient continuities stretching back for thousands of years. Japan had the size and position to develop a system which stands alone in the world, being neither of the East nor of the West. It has absorbed and transformed 3 great Chinese waves and 3 European American ones. All of them have broken over the rocky coasts of Japan, leaving valuable alternatives and enriching it hugely. Yet none of them have altered its basic, mechanically integrated, enchanted nature. Beneath the surface of restless small changes, it has, like a miraculous Australia, maintained a unique set of flora and fauna which enriches us all. For the Japanese, despite Maruyama's pessimism and some disastrous failures, have managed to combine the uncombinable and produced a pretty decent life for a large number of people in a difficult environment. They seem to have avoided what seemed the inevitable traps facing all modern civilizations, to have largely avoided Marxist alienation, Durkheimian anomie, and Weber's iron cage of rationality. That they have achieved the apparently impossible alters the way in which we look at the world. As Fosco Marini puts it, Japan is a great electric shock. It makes us realize that modern civilization, the one that we so fondly and naturally imagine to be civilization tout court, can have different versions, alternative patterns. The Western model of modern civilization turns out as one of a series of possibilities. Japan opens our mental horizons. If Japan did not exist, Japan would have to be urgently invented. End of quote. In order to understand the Japanese exception, two of our principal guides are Fukuzawa and Maruyama. They understood Japan, and they almost understood the West. Without their insights and translating skills, I would have found myself lost forever in the magical enchantment that is Japan. They helped me to explore the looking glass land, and they have also helped me to return out of the mirror to look at my own world in a different way. Thank you.